This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Institute of International European Affairs. My name is Barry Holfer. I'm the Director of Research. Very, very pleased to invite you to this special event on peacemaking and the future of the United Nations with our guest, Thant Myint-U. In his remarks to the IIEA, Thant Myint-U will reflect upon the future of world peace and the United Nations through the lens of a new book, Peacemaker, U-Thant, grandfather, and the forgotten quest for a just world, which is probably a bit less forgotten about now, given your, what I'm told is an excellent book. Thant tracks the history of his grandfather, U-Thant, the first UN Secretary General of Color, who became the Cold War era's preeminent ambassador of peace and played a crucial role in preventing conflicts such as during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I also was reading a review of your book, and Bronwyn Everett in Foreign Policy described your grandfather as the man who made the UN cool. I think is really quite the flattering, you know. Thant's remarks will reflect not only on the events of the 1960s, but the lessons which U-Thant, your grandfather's tenure, may offer us now during a moment of escalating global tensions. Now, I'm going to very briefly introduce you as speaker, so don't blush because your biography is overwhelming. And I just want to acknowledge briefly a great friend of the Institute, Michael Doyle, who's a former EU ambassador. Thanks to Michael's connection here that we have Thant with us this evening. So thanks very much for that, Michael. Dr. Thant Myint-U is an award-winning author, historian, and international public servant. He's written 5 books, most recently the aforementioned Peacemaker, U-Thant, and the Forgotten Quest for a Just World, forthcoming, September 2025. So, could you give me a few minutes?
It's last week in London and Northern in New York.
Fantastic. Great publishing houses. In addition, we have Where China Meets India, Burma and the Crossroads of Asia, The Hidden History of Burma, Race, Capitalism, and the Crisis of Democracy in the 21st Century. Thant was educated at Harvard and Cambridge and taught history for several years as a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He's also served on United Nations peacekeeping operations in Cambodia and former Yugoslavia, and from 2000 to 2007 at the UN Secretariat in New York. Hello, from 2011 to 2021, Thant helped lead reform efforts in Myanmar, including as a presidential advisor, and he was the founding chairman of the Yangon Heritage Trust and the chairman of U-Thant House. He currently lives in Cambridge and is an honorary fellow at Trinity College. Your whole life seems to have been somehow attached to the UN. It seems to run through you, both in terms of what you've done, yourself, what you've written about it, and your family. So I'm really excited to have you here. Thanks for accepting the invitation. The discussion here is on the record. There's obviously those around the table in full technicolor and those joining online. Everyone can participate. So after, I think we said 25, 30 minutes, Thant is going to speak about his book, but also try and locate it in its wider context and maybe some of the lessons one might draw from it. And then we'll turn to the audience for our questions. Thant, are you happy with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Hand over to you, and just many thanks and very warm welcome once again.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to be here today. It's really a delight to be back in Dublin and be speaking here to all of you and also everyone online as well. So I'll speak for about 25 minutes about my book. I'll show a few photographs if we have time, and then say a little bit about what all this means, the history that I'm trying to research and tell for the UN today and what could happen in the UN in the future. I think I want to start a little bit with a sort of a deep dive into history. I think most of you know, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the UN was first conceived in 1943, 1954 as an enforcement mechanism. It was meant to be a continuation of the wartime alliance, centered very much on the US, the UK, and the USSR. And the central assumption behind the UN was that the Soviets and the Americans would work well together in creating this new architecture and policing the rest of the world. And there are even ideas back then for the world to be encircled by UN air bases jointly manned by the Soviets and the Americans, who would take on the Germans and the Japanese if they reappeared, and deal with any other aggressor as well. But of course, even by the time Yangon died in San Francisco with the charter that was written in June 1945, that initial conception was seen to have been dated. And in the earliest years of the UN, many people said this organization It's no longer fit for purpose. It's not going to work. We might have to go back to scratch. So people were already doubting and calling for UN reform, even as early as 1946, 1947. And the UN sort of tried to still be effective in different ways, but it was very much hobbled because the central institution of the UN that was meant to deal with war and peace, the Security Council, was then, as now, and many times in between, paralyzed. That you had was within the council to deal with vetoes of permanent members. And then something happened in the 1950s, the mid 1950s, which was not foreseen by the architects of the UN, by the founders of the UN, which was the emergence of the Secretary General of the UN as a mediator. That's nowhere written in the charter. But especially under the pioneering leadership of Dag Hammarskjöld, the Swedish second Secretary General of the UN, he became the world's preeminent diplomat. And beginning with the Suez Crisis in 1956, but then over those later part of the 1950s, in a number of different conflicts, he showed a tremendous amount of creativity, ingenuity in inserting himself into conflicts and trying to mediate. But he lost his balance. And after a while, the Soviets refused to speak to him. The French refused to speak to him. And it was quite clear by 1960, 61 that he might have to resign sooner rather than later. And as we all know now, he was killed in a still mysterious plane crash in September of 1961, almost certainly as a result of foul play in the Congo on his way to trying to negotiate a ceasefire. But the other thing that had happened by that time was that, and again, not foreseen by the founders of the UN, was not just the decolonization of a lot of the world, but the entry of many of these newly decolonized countries from Asia and Africa, the Afro-Asians, as they call themselves, of the UN, into the UN, becoming the biggest bloc within the General Assembly. I think if the Americans, and they say this in the State Department notes in 1944, that if they had foreseen that that would happen, that they would lose that majority in the General Assembly, they probably would have designed it in a different way. But they did lose that majority. They put a lot of store into the Secretary Generalship. But the main thing was that these Afro-Asians, under this generation of charismatic post-independence leaders from India, from Ghana, from Indonesia, from elsewhere, really tried to make the UN their own. They embraced the UN Charter in a way that actually many of the European governments, much more conservative in relation to the UN, didn't. Really wanting to realize the aims of the UN and understanding that their independence wouldn't mean very much if it wasn't within an international system that was based on the sovereign equality of states. And I think for a lot of these countries, the key thing was not just nominal independence, the British handing over a piece of paper or having a ceremony, but that they were part of the system that they created themselves. And it would lead not only to this political equality, but also to economic equality as well, which is very important to them. And I think sitting in the West or sitting in the UK or sitting in the US, we often see the 20th century history, the 20th century history of World War I, World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War. But I think it's important to note that for most of the world, the history of the 20th century is the history of empire and post-empire. And the UN's role in that transition from empire to post-empire is an enormous part of the story of how we created the world and the international system that we have today. So in 1961, if we go back to that moment, the UN was actually in its perhaps deepest crisis ever. The organization was broke because the Soviets and the French were refusing to pay their dues. The Secretary General was dead. There were 20,000 plus troops in the Congo, including the Irish battalion, a company that was in Jadotville, not knowing exactly what to do next. And it looked very much like the Soviets were going to pull the rug from the UN, that they were insisting on what they called the Troika formula of 3 secretaries general, not one, which effectively hobbled the organization. And many people were predicting that the UN would last weeks, maybe months, if not weeks. And because they thought it would be impossible in that Cold War situation with the Berlin crisis, that they could agree on anyone to be Secretary, the sole Secretary General of the UN. So enter from stage left, I guess, my grandfather, who was then 49, 50 years, about 51 years old at the time. But until he was almost 40 years old, he had been a school teacher in a small town in Burma. And he was born in 1909. And until he was almost 40 years old, he had never left the town except for a couple of years at university. He was born to a well-to-do landowning family that had become suddenly impoverished when he was 15. He couldn't finish university as he had planned. And so he taught school to support his three younger brothers. And he was in this little town, sort of ramshackle, wooden houses, dirt roads, no electricity, no running water. But subscribing to every newspaper and magazine he could from London, from Calcutta, that came by sea, and writing op-ed and letters to the editor, trying to be part of the world, translating books about the new nations, alone in this small town doing these things. And then he decided to leave. It was a midlife career change. And within 10 years, he entered government service, he rose rapidly. And within 10 years, he found himself in New York City, in Midtown Manhattan, in the heart of this new global politics, as part of this wave of Afro-Asian ambassadors that came into the organization. Very much supportive of what Hammarskjöld was trying to do at the time, and working most closely with not only the other Afro-Asian ambassadors from Iraq, from Egypt, from Indonesia, from elsewhere, but also from countries like Ireland and Sweden, the neutral countries that were so important, the work and the energy behind the UN at that time. Maybe the next slide. So that's him with Hammarskjöld when he was ambassador for us. Survived a couple of years before that. And if you show the next slide, that's him in 1960 at the Historic General Assembly that hosted this unparalleled up until that time collection of world leaders arriving. And these are the Afro-Asians. You see Nasser and Nkrumah. That's U-Thant, who was the ambassador then for Burma, Nehru and Sukarno. And the next slide. And that's him with Frank Aiken from Ireland, who got to know him quite well, and they worked quite closely together in the halls of the General Assembly and other UN bodies at that time. Next slide. So in 1961, it's a complicated story I tell in my book, but he becomes the Secretary General. He had developed a reputation over those few years as ambassador as the man who got along with everyone. And he identified himself, or he saw himself as a bridge builder, not just between East and West, but especially between South and North. That he thought if Burma, after independence, could become friends with the British, why can't this new third world also have the best possible relationship with the West? If only the West would also agree to stop interfering in these countries and respect their sovereignty in a way that they wanted. And he appointed this team of people. That photograph doesn't look that strange today, but in those days, I mean, to have three men of color at the top in bureaucracy at the UN in diplomacy was a new thing. His deputy was Dr. Ralph Bunche, who was a Nobel laureate who mediated the 1949 Israeli-Arab ceasefire armistice. And his chief military man, Ricky, was from India. Next slide. I'll get to the cat in a minute, but I won't tell the whole story. I don't want this to be, like a trailer where you feel like you've seen the whole movie or be able to read book. But I do want to just touch on a couple of key parts of his time, and then I'll move on to the current situation and what it means. Which was that he was thrown immediately into this UN crisis. The biggest crisis he had to deal with then was the Congo situation, where you had these 20,000 troops. Now, the Congo is really interesting. It's a big part of Irish history as well, because to some extent you can see it as a Cold War type issue, because the Americans were worried about Russian influence at the time. But for these Afro-Asians, for the Global South, as we would call them now, the main thing about the Congo was that it was the critical test, because you had the Katanga secession in the south, the British province that had broken away, with Belgian mercenaries, South African mercenaries, British mercenaries, white supremacist networks, and propping them up. And for the Afro-Asians, it was a test for the people who were propping up the Katanga secession, it was part of a scheme, or a bigger scheme, to see if white minority rule would still be possible throughout Southern Africa, from Katanga south, through Rhodesia, South Africa, what is now Namibia, elsewhere. And for the Afro-Asians, this was their nightmare, that independence would not really be independence, that these countries would become independent, but sooner or later, different Western countries would start to interfere, hive off different places, call it humanitarian intervention, and everything else. And so that took a very different tack from Hammarskjöld. He wanted the UN force that was on the ground to become a warfighting machine. And he used the Indonesians, the Indians, the others to prop up that force. And they basically later went to war against Katanga. It's a complicated story where the British actually tried to reel him in. Harold Macmillan telling President Kennedy by telephone that unless U-Thant stops, his conservative government would fall within 48 hours. And Kennedy agreed, put pressure on U-Thant and restrained him initially. The reason that that's important is that U-Thant in January 1962 decided that if he was going to get anywhere, if he was going to be allowed in a way to unleash that force and finish the action that he wanted to take in Katanga, he had to develop the best possible relationship with Kennedy and also with the family. And so that's what he did over the next 6 months. He tried to outflank the Europeans. He met Kennedy many times. They bonded over drinks and cigars and a couple of different occasions. He flew to the Black Sea, met with Khrushchev in Crimea, swam with him, had a big lunch. What he didn't know was that exactly at that same time, the first Soviet ships were sailing across the Atlantic with missiles for Cuba. And so when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out in October of 1962, his big asset was that he had already developed very good personal relationships with the Russians and the Americans at the very top. And I'll just say something about the Cuban Missile Crisis and then go on to the present day, because I think it's an important story in terms of thinking about what is possible the UN Secretary General going forward. In 1962, October 22nd, as we all know, President Kennedy goes on television, tells the whole world there's Soviet missiles in Cuba, the Americans are imposing a blockade. Soviet ships are approaching that blockade. In the traditional way of telling that story, Kennedy is both skillful, but also extremely tough. And eventually the Soviets have turned their ships around. And that's kind of the end of the story. And they make a deal, and there's a secret deal about missiles in Turkey. Nowhere, almost nowhere in the secondary sources, and nowhere in the television shows or movies do you see a Burmese guy with his Indian and Egyptian deputies mediating sides. And what actually happened over those days was that the first 24 hours after Kennedy gives his speech, he's in intense consultation with the leaders of the Afro-Asian bloc, with all of their ambassadors in New York, with his friends in the Irish mission and the Swedish mission and elsewhere. And he decides he's going to intervene without any mandate, without any authorization from the Security Council or elsewhere. He feels that the clock is ticking and he has to do something. And he begins a series of different messages, both to Kennedy and to Khrushchev, privately as well as publicly. He goes to the Security Council and lays out what will become the basis of settlement, a trade of Soviet missiles in Cuba for an American pledge not to invade the island. He not only sends these messages to both men, but he actually secretly communicates with John F. Kennedy at this crucial moment as well, 25th, 26th that night. He waits. They speak to each other around. They don't speak to each other, but they message each other around that time. The White House calls U-Thant, asks him to send a second message to Khrushchev because they already sent one message, but rewriting it as his own and sending it to the Kremlin to actually turn all the ships around. Because U-Thant's initial message was simply for the Soviets to suspend their shipment of weapons and for the Americans to suspend the blockade. Now, there's a lot more to that story, but the crucial thing is that for the Soviets, we now know, it was much easier to respond to a request for peace from a neutral UN Secretary General than to respond to an ultimatum from the American president. But with that, what he saw very clearly, in a way that Kennedy and Khrushchev also saw, is that this wasn't a military crisis, it was a political crisis, and that his intervention, U-Thant's intervention as Secretary General, had to be to craft that intervention that would provide both sides with the time and the space needed for diplomacy. That he had to do the song and dance, he had to send the messages, he had to make the public statements that would create that room, that breathing space. Step back from the nuclear way. Kennedy used it in another way as well, which is you hear on the audio tapes of the ex-com meetings, Kennedy and his advisors over that following week. At least a couple of times when Kennedy's advisors say to him, we have to invade Cuba now, not tomorrow. And we now know to catastrophe that the Soviets already had not just nuclear missiles, but tactical nuclear missiles, atomic weapons on the ground, as well as it would have used against the American invasion. Kennedy says, no, we have to wait for U-Thant's diplomacy. So Kennedy is also using U-Thant's messages, his diplomacy, his public statements, as a shield to try to give himself time to figure out exactly what to do. He flies to Havana, U-Thant, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro by that time is fuming because the Americans and the Soviets are coming together around a framework and they're sort of leaving him out. And U-Thant on the second day, he meets with him alone and says, "Look, you're from a small country, I'm from a small country. You have every right to have foreign military bases, to have foreign missiles, but sovereignty. But I'm going to paint you the bigger picture. We're on the verge of a nuclear war, and we all have to calm down and take a step back." And Castro goes on television the next day in Cuba and says, "U-Thant showed us respect." And then for the Cubans as well, U-Thant becomes this neutral point of reference that he then uses to agree to certain steps around the verification process. That's just one story. I mean, that's at the very beginning of his term over 10 years. And the rest of those 10 years on Vietnam, the Six-Day War, Biafra, Bangladesh, Pakistan War in 65, many other problems. There were successes as well as failures. And that's the book, is really, can this ex-school teacher from Burma, catapulted to this position, deal with the Cold War at that time? And what does he make of the Secretary General? And why was he then subsequently almost forgotten by history? So in the time that I have left, let me just say a few words about then what this all means for today. I think if we think about subsequent UN history, there was that opening that I mentioned, created originally by Dag Hammarskjöld. The office of Secretary General really was flying high in the late 1950s, especially into the early 1960s. And then it continued. This mediation focus was a huge part, I think, of the unraveling of the Cold War as well in the early 1980s, early 1990s, where the UN, through very quiet and very skillful but patient mediation on El Salvador, on East Timor, on Namibia, on Angola, on many other countries, set the stage for what will become a series of comprehensive peacekeeping. I think the turn that the UN took in the 90s, 2000s, was a UN under Kofi Annan, when I worked there and also later, in a much more, less in some ways, multilateral way. It was a UN that became much more dominated by Western donors. It was a much more north to south set of interventions, many of it good in the end, I mean, done in good faith to provide peacekeeping operations, to provide aid, but it did change the nature of the UN, a large extent. And that's the UN that's kind of falling apart now from lack of that donor funding coming in from the Americans, by others as well. We are in a crisis, the UN, a crisis of identity, a crisis of relevance, as well as a crisis of funding. But my concluding argument would be that I think we need to look back to history to some extent to remember that, as Conor Cruz O'Brien said, I think he wrote it 68 or 69, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but there are many conflicts and wars where you don't need the UN to solve. It could be done by a country, a regional organization, by others. But every now and then there's a war or conflict, maybe even a nuclear confrontation, where someone called the Secretary General of the UN becomes indispensable in resolving or de-escalating that conflict. And I think as we approach a year when we're going to select a new UN Secretary General, it's important to go back to where it's been useful, the office of the Secretary General, and thinking about the kind of person who might again play that role of peace. So let me start with that, so we have a lot of time for another question. Thank you so much, Thant.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.